Okay, we are live. We are live. Welcome to the debate. Greg Johnson versus Mark Collett. Today we will be debating, well, Mark and Greg will be debating the issue of Ukraine and Russia and what perspective nationalists should take in the Anglosphere. Um, Anyway, so
I've just achieved victory. That's it.
oh, he just disappeared. Anyway, I guess he'll be back soon. Anyway, while we're waiting for Greg to to return, I'm just going to just lay out the rules. I already told you guys in private, but I'm just letting everyone know we're going to go 10 minutes each way, opening statements, and then we're going to go through. I have like 6 questions. You'll get 5 minutes each. I'm going to have strict time limits. I will cut you off if. Okay, Greg is back. Yeah, I'm going to have strict time limits. I will cut you off if you kind of go over the time limit. So that will be enforced. And as well, there's super chats if people want to ask questions at the end. I don't know if Greg and Mark will hang around, but some other friends might come on afterwards if they don't anyway. We'll kind of break down the debate. So open invitation to the both of you to hang around afterwards. But no, it's fine if you guys need to go. Now, I believe, and the link to the super chat is in the description. Entropy tree stream. There's a link in the description if you want to send one in. So anyway, so let's get into it. So Greg, you wanted to go first. So I'll start your timer now.
Okay, I want to thank you, Joel, for hosting and moderating, and also Mark for joining me in what I want to bill as a civil airing of differences on the Ukraine war. The first question we need to ask is, why are white nationalists commenting on this war in the first place? I am under no illusions that my opinions on this war, one way or another, will have any effect whatsoever on the outcomes. So why talk about it at all? Because even if my commentary will have no short-term effect on the war, I'm playing a much longer game. I'm an advocate for white nationalism. As I define it, white nationalism is a species of ethno-nationalism, the view that the best world order consists of sovereign states for all peoples who aspire to them. Ethno-nationalism is the best global order for 2 principal reasons. First, it respects the differences between peoples and races and secures their own spaces in which they can live according to their own identities and develop as they will. Second, multiracial, multicultural empires are cauldrons of ethnic strife and hatred and the erasure of identity. By separating warring tribes into their own homelands, ethno-nationalism promotes peace. Now, ethno-nationalism is opposed to imperialism in all its forms. Imperialism is a form of multiculturalism in which different peoples are subject to a single political order, which again encourages hatred, conflicts, and cultural destruction. So ethno-nationalists, however, do not oppose trade and cooperation and amity between sovereign states, including the creation of things like customs unions to facilitate commerce or defensive pacts against aggression. Now, the main reason I comment on the Ukraine war is to show the relevance of white ethno-nationalist ideas. Russia is the world's largest land empire, and it used to be much larger, embracing Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, the Caucasus, the Central Asian stands, and after the Second World War, it ruled the Warsaw Pact nations as well. Now, after the collapse of communism, these nations gained their independence. Now, post-communist Russia is an obscenely rapacious oligarchy ruled largely by former communists, including state security spooks like Vladimir Putin. They tyrannize over a profoundly degraded populace with astonishingly high rates of alcoholism, drug abuse, divorce, abortion, HIV infection, and domestic violence. Imagine an America where outside of New York and Los Angeles, everything else consists of West Virginia and Indian reservations, and you get a sense of what the Russian Federation today is like. Now, Russia's ruling elite openly mourns the collapse of the Soviet Empire and dreams of putting it back together. Russia fought 2 bloody wars against the Chechens to prevent them from gaining their independence. Russia uses ethnic Russian minorities in neighboring states as fifth columnists and pretexts for interventions. They have fomented riots in the Baltic states. They have fomented secessionist and irredentist wars in the Caucasus, Moldova, and Ukraine. About the only former imperial possession Russia has not meddled in is Belarus, which is a wholly subservient satellite state. Now, after the collapse of communism, Ukraine had a referendum on independence. Every single region voted for independence from Moscow. In 1994, Russia and the United States were parties to the Budapest Accord, which recognized Ukraine's 1991 borders in exchange for nuclear disarmament. Despite this, Russia has worked for decades to turn Ukraine into a Belarus-style satellite. Ukraine overwhelmingly favored pursuing EU membership. In 2013, Russia tried to prevent this with economic sanctions. Then Putin basically just bought Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, who abruptly reversed course on EU membership, which sparked the Maidan Revolution, which I call a glorious outburst of Ukrainian nationalism and Russian slander as an American intelligence operation. Meanwhile, Russia launched its own military and intelligence ops in Ukraine, seizing control of Crimea and fomenting separatist movements in the Donbass. Now, 8 years later, Russia has invaded Ukraine with the express aim of regime change and denazification. Ukraine, Russians claim, is a fake country. Ukrainians think they are a different people, but this is false consciousness, and they have to be educated out of this by destroying their language and their national identity. This is a war of imperial conquest, pure and simple, and its frank aim can be defined as cultural genocide. The pretexts about the Donbass and NATO encroachment are transparently cynical, and they're not to be taken seriously. If you believe that distinct peoples deserve their own homelands, if you believe that wars of conquest and cultural genocide are evil things, then of course you should sympathize with Ukraine over Russia. But again, our sympathies are not going to change this war one way or the other. The only reason I comment on this war is to uphold the correct ethno-nationalist principles and show their relevance. Because I hope that in the very long run, if we can get enough people of vision and goodwill on our side, ethno-nationalism might create a better world free from the horrors of things like the Ukraine war. But I do, however, want to end this opening statement by making one brief nod to realpolitik, but specifically only with regard to the white nationalist movement itself, because within the movement, I think that my commentary does have the ability to change things. In my view, Vladimir Putin is very, very bad for white nationalism in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the West. After taking power, Putin closed the Soviet archives to revisionist researchers. He criminalized historical revisionism. He passed sweeping anti-hate legislation, which was used to target not just outright National Socialists, but milquetoast immigration reformers. Putin also set up a fake nationalist movement, which combines the usual raft of conservative cultural values with Russian imperialism, which is a multicultural ideology opposed in principle to all forms of ethnic nationalism. Putin's fake Russian nationalist movement has aggressively courted nationalists in the West. I remember in 2014 when Leonid Savin, one of Dugin's followers, submitted an article on quote-unquote Donbass ethno-nationalism to Countercurrents. I was offended. Did he really think I was that stupid? I also remember a conversation with a Eurasianist who said that suitcases full of Russian and Iranian cash could be conjured up if one gave platforms for their propaganda. I was pretty sure he was delusional. And beyond that, you can't get to an ethno-nationalist world if you're suddenly willing to shill for Russian imperialism and anti-nationalism. Today, our movement's only advantages are the truth and the credibility one wins by speaking it. And compromising one's principles and credibility for what exactly is simply self-defeating. But given the behavior of some nationalists in the US and Europe, I suspect they were taken in. Now, that's a battle that I can fight and win, which is why Countercurrents has taken a leading role in combating, frankly, the Russian subversion of the white nationalist movement since 2014. We published a number of articles on white nationalist delusions about Russia, for instance, which have been quite popular. So I just want to end by saying this. As a white nationalist, my worst nightmare would be a Donald Trump dictatorship. Why? Because Trump's committed to a multicultural, multiracial, civic nationalist vision of America. Given that, even if he built a wall, the white race in America would be relentlessly eroded by differential fertility, miscegenation, and legal immigration. And under a Trump dictatorship, there would be no way to change it. Trump would turn countless potential right-wing dissidents into planned trusters who would embrace and make excuses for white genocide as long as Trump appealed to their conservative values and authoritarian personalities. Imagine the fate of Kevin McDonald under the dictatorship of the man who pardoned Jonathan Pollard. Imagine the fate of Jared Taylor under the dictatorship of the man who gave us the Platinum Plan. That nightmare is reality under Putin's dictatorship today, and that is the nightmare he's going to bring to Ukraine, and I say hell no to that.
Okay, so Mark, your opening statement.
The greatest threat to the existence of people of European descent is Judeo-American Western liberal democracy. Every white nation that falls under the influence of the American state is subject to 3 attacks. The first of these attacks targets the ethnic integrity of the people of that nation and is carried out by means of unchecked mass immigration and state-enforced multiculturalism. The second of these attacks is aimed at destroying the moral fabric of the people of that nation and comes in the form of the aggressive promotion of the LGBT agenda, an attack on traditionalism, the undermining of family values, and the mocking and tearing down of Christianity. The third of these attacks is to limit the rights of the people of the nation that is under attack. This is done to limit the ability of those people to resist and organize against attack number 1 and attack number 2. These attacks on Western nations have been going on since the end of the Second World War and have only intensified since the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, when the Berlin Wall stood, the general consensus was that Russia and the Soviet Union were the bad guys and America and NATO were the good guys. However, those that believed this very simple and highly propagandized assessment of that geopolitical divide could not have been more wrong. Communism was, of course, a brutal and destructive force for people of European descent, and communism subjugated the people under its influence, bringing immense suffering and death to European nations, but it did so visibly and openly. Once the Iron Curtain fell, those nations that had survived for decades under communist tyranny emerged ethnically and morally intact and ready to embrace something better: nationalism. During the Cold War, those European nations that lay on the Western side of the Iron Curtain willingly embraced the American state as a friend and happily took on the Judeo-American Western liberal values that the American state offered. The gifts of sexual liberation, free love, pornography, mass immigration, diversity, tolerance, and of course the mantra of do what makes you feel good were nothing more than a series of poisoned chalices that slowly destroyed the people of each nation that drank from them. Whilst communism collapsed and those in the East were happy to throw off the shackles of their communist oppressors and turn to something better, family, folk, and faith, those in the West simply begged for more of the poison that the American state fed to them. dancing and cavorting with insane grins on their faces as their nations crumbled around them and their folk were bred out of existence thanks to the values instilled in them by their greatest ally. And since the collapse of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the flow of the poison that has been corrupting and destroying Western nations has only increased. In fact, since the 1990s, the madness that has been afflicting white people has increased exponentially, both in terms of its volume and the level of its toxicity. This is in large part because the Judeo-American state and NATO have not had a serious global counterbalance for over 3 decades. However, this is changing. On the 30th of September, Vladimir Putin made the most important speech that any world leader has made since the end of the Second World War. In this speech, he attacked replacement migration, he defended the traditional family, he pushed back against the LGBT agenda, he stood up for Christianity, he rebuked Western nations for their anti-free speech laws, he spoke out against the unjustified wars in the Middle East that Western nations have fought on behalf of Israel. He talked of American war crimes in Japan and Germany at the end of the Second World War. And most importantly, he labeled Western elites as a satanic cabal and proclaimed that they openly oppress not only people of other nations, but also their own people. The speech is as strong, as well delivered, and as poignant as any speech I have heard from any nationalist leader, elected or otherwise. But this speech was not made by some rabble-rouser in the back room of a pub. It was not made by a pseudo-intellectual on YouTube. It was not made by an MEP or an MP of a civic nationalist party in Europe. It was made by the leader of a world superpower and a man who leads a country that is an integral part of a bloc of nations that represents the largest counterbalance to Judeo-American Western liberal democracy that we have seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But unlike the Soviet Union, this new counterbalance to Judeo-American Western liberal democracy is using terminology that would be more in line with that used by nationalist powers pre-World War II. This is why the American State Department and America's vassal states in Europe are so desperate to see regime change in Russia. And make no mistake, the conflict in the Ukraine is all about regime change. Whether that regime change comes from ludicrous sanctions, which are likely to kill more Europeans this winter than Russians, or whether that regime change comes from an ever bloodier conflict in eastern Ukraine, the American state does not care. And the European lives that will be lost are merely collateral damage to those who control America. America has used NATO to repeatedly poke the bear. NATO has aggressively expanded into Eastern Europe, despite repeated reassurances to Russia that it would not do so. Now NATO and America seek to place weapons on Russia's borders, almost mirroring the Cuban Missile Crisis that took place in 1962. This provocation alone would be enough to anger Russia, but it is not the only provocation that the American state has engaged in. From the CIA-backed color revolution in 2014 to the wholesale slaughter of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, America has put in place a new Ukrainian establishment and has encouraged and allowed that establishment to stoke the fires of war, giving Russia very little choice but to draw a line in the sand and then defend that line. And that is a crucial point. The special operation in eastern Ukraine is not an imperial war waged by a resurgent USSR, as NATO and the Western media would like to claim, and any nationalist claiming such things should be ashamed of themselves. It is in fact America and Britain's imperialistic foreign wars and interventions that have left millions of people dead in Europe and the Middle East over the last 30 years. It is not Russian foreign policy to invade, bomb, and destabilize nations on behalf of Israel, or to launch military operations to bring about social change and usher in progressive politics. In fact, in recent memory, it was Russia that saved Serbia from NATO's bombs. It was Russia that destroyed the American-backed ISIS militants in Syria and saved the Christian minority that was protected under that secular Syrian government. It is the American state that has terrorized the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall, not Russia. And make no mistake, this war too was started by America and its puppet government, the Ukrainian establishment. But that Ukrainian establishment, the one that I just mentioned, well, It's not actually Ukrainian. It is the most Jewish government in Europe. The four men in charge of the Ukraine are Zelensky, the president, Shimel, the prime minister, Reznikov, the defense minister, and Yermak, the chief of staff. All of them are Jewish, which is something mirrored within the American State Department, where the three people in charge of America's vehemently anti-Russian agenda are, you guessed it, all Jewish. Anthony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, and Victoria Nuland. And sadly, there are nationalists supporting these people and their war, a war that is killing tens of thousands of white men. And if America and its Jewish puppet government in the Ukraine succeed, if the Ukrainian forces emerge victorious, what brave new world would they usher in for the Ukrainian people? Pride parades in the streets, transgender lessons in school, drag queen story hour in local libraries, gay adoption, hundreds of thousands of African migrants per year flooding into the Ukraine. To let Judeo-American Western liberal democratic values win in the Ukraine is to destroy the Ukrainian people, not by conventional means of warfare, but by a slow mental and moral poisoning, the same poisoning that has destroyed Britain, America, and other Western nations. Vladimir Putin may not be perfect, and indeed he is not an ethno-nationalist. However, he did not start this war, nor is he the one pumping LGBT propaganda into our schools or endorsing swamping levels of mass immigration into the West. In fact, he presents a powerful counterbalance against those who do such things in Western nations. And if Russia was to fall, that would place all the power in the hands of the American state. And we know what that would lead to. I do not want to see any more bloodshed in the Ukraine, but I am not going to stand behind the Judeo-American state, nor am I going to stand behind the most Jewish regime in Europe. I believe in self-determination for all European people, including those in the Ukraine. But that self-determination does not come from allying with America, and if history has taught us anything, it is that falling under American influence is the most dangerous thing a European nation can do. But I'll leave you with a quote, as Henry Kissinger summed it up best. To be an enemy of America can be dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal.
Okay, so I'm going to go start with the questions so that we can kind of move this along. So first question is to both of you, and obviously, Greg, you can go first. Was Russia justified in invading Ukraine? Yes or no, and why? And secondarily, what responsibility does NATO have in creating the Ukraine crisis?
No, Russia's invasion is not justified. It's pure imperialism. I would say naked imperialism, were it not for the tiny fig leaf of the genocide, as they call it, in Donbass and NATO encroachment. I do think the US was stringing along Zelensky with the possibility of NATO membership to bait Putin into this war. I think the US had a very clear idea of how corrupt and weak the Putin regime and the Russian military proved to be. I think they believed that a defeat for Putin could bring about regime change. I think Putin was a fool to start this war, but bait it or not, he was the one who started it. And on a deeper level, although NATO has, on a deeper level, though, I don't think NATO has any real responsibility for this war for this simple reason. The Ukraine joining NATO was a disposable pretext. If NATO had given Zelensky a hard no, Putin would have invented another pretext because I think he was hell-bent on seizing Ukraine and thought it would be easy. There's a lot of disinformation about NATO out there. NATO made no promises to Gorbachev not to expand east. They did promise not to put nukes in East Germany, a promise they kept. NATO expanded to the east because the countries there had legitimate security concerns vis-a-vis Russia. Unlike the Russian Empire or the Soviet bloc, NATO did not expand by conquest. NATO is a defensive alliance that countries asked to join. Nor did NATO rebuff Russia. Putin asked why Russia was not invited into NATO, and he was told that countries apply to join and the members vote on it. Putin said that Russia would not wait in line behind insignificant countries, and that was the end of it. Putin's attitude, of course, is pure Russian chauvinism. Under international law, all sovereign states are equal, hence equal treatment by NATO. Putin, however, thinks that you're only as sovereign as you are powerful. He doesn't fundamentally respect the sovereignty of smaller, weaker nations, which is why Russia's former satellites wanted into NATO in the first place. Nor does NATO threaten Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance. It would not go to war with Russia unless Russia attacked one of its members. Beyond that, Russia has an enormous nuclear deterrent. Nobody is going to start a war with Russia because of that. The idea that Russia cannot live behind its 2013 borders is nutty, yet we're told that this is an existential conflict. But the only thing existentially threatened by staying within its borders is Russia's imperialist mentality. NATO was built to contain Soviet imperialism. When the USSR was dissolved, it looked like NATO was obsolete, but that impression turns out to have been wrong. Russia's post-communist regime mourned the loss of their empire and immediately set to work subverting the newly independent nations, which is why 15 of them applied to join NATO. The only reason Ukraine was invaded is because it was not in NATO and did not enjoy its protection. This is why Sweden and Finland have now joined NATO, and Armenia and Georgia should probably join as well. Putin's war has strengthened NATO enormously, which was a totally predictable consequence that he apparently didn't take into account. So I think that, no, this is not justified. And NATO is not responsible for this. It's all on Putin.
Okay, so Mark, just to restate the question, or do you remember?
No, can you reset? Yeah, can you?
Yeah, I'll restate it. So first of all, was Russia justified in invading? And second of all, what responsibility does NATO have, in your estimation, for the crisis?
How long do I have?
5 minutes.
Russia was absolutely justified. You see, Greg keeps talking about the idea of ethno-states, but he's being very disingenuous here. And I want to say something else. I feel it's rather disingenuous of Greg to imply that certain people on the right are paid by the Kremlin, which certain countercurrent writers have done. I think that's very unfair, and I think that's unjust to start saying things like that. The fact is, the Ukraine as a nation didn't exist till 1918, and since its existence, or since it came into existence, its borders have been redrawn numerous times, and numerous different ethnic groups live there. There are ethnic Russians, part of Poland was absorbed into the Ukraine. It's very much a nation that would be analogous with somewhere like the former Yugoslavia. As such, the different people who live in the Ukraine and the numerous redrawing of its borders means that those people also have their ethnic determination. And there are many ethnic Russians, many Russian speakers, and many people within the Ukrainian sphere, such as in the Crimea, which is now part of Russia, that were always Russian, that have been Russian for centuries. Now, in 2019, when Zelensky was elected, he was actually elected on a platform of peace with Moscow, closer ties with Russia, and he was elected on a platform that looked as if peace was going to be the route that he would take. He did not then pursue peace. He did the absolute opposite of that. He dismantled parts of the media that were pro-Russian. He banned different political movements that were pro-Russian, and he ran in the very opposite direction to the direction voters voted for him to go in. This was a Fed op. This was an American state op, just like the 2014 revolution, the Maidan Revolution. People say, well, that was an expression of the Ukrainian people. Well, if that was an expression of the Ukrainian people, it is very interesting how Jewish the Ukrainian establishment has turned out to be, because that is not representative of either the Ukrainians in the Ukraine or the ethnic Cossacks, the Tatars, or the ethnic Russians who live on the eastern border. Now, the fact is, what we are seeing here in terms of NATO trying to move into the Ukraine, weapons being placed in the Ukraine, is analogous to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Greg says, well, no one would ever start a hot war with Russia because Russia has nuclear missiles. How did America react when nuclear missiles or Russian weapons were placed on America's borders? they issued an ultimatum, but the USSR were good enough to back down and remove their weapons. America has not done the same because the Jewish American State Department wanted to provoke this conflict. That's why Minsk and Minsk II were both violated, with thousands of ethnic Russians being slaughtered by people LARPing as National Socialists under the Azov banner. And again, this shows just how strange the American State Department is. It will use people LARPing as National Socialists if they get the job done, which is provoking Putin. But even when Putin did mount this special operation, when he moved into eastern Ukraine, he only moved in with 190,000 troops. It was not a war of an extermination. It was nothing like the American war in Iraq or Afghanistan. In fact, very little damage has been done outside of the eastern parts of the Ukraine. Putin has made it clear he's actually giving self-determination and protection to ethnic Russians, and he is being goaded time and time again by the American State Department, the CIA, and groups that want to bring about regime change in Russia. And the reason they want to bring about regime change in Russia is because they do not want any strong counterbalance to Judeo-American Western liberal democracy. But without that counterbalance, everybody in the West is more at risk from an America that has no rivals.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So I wanted to stay with NATO for the second question, but this question, let's move away from Ukraine and discuss NATO in general. What attitude should nationalists in the Anglosphere have towards NATO, and is NATO a anti-white political force? Again, Greg, jump in here. You got 5 minutes.
Well, let's not limit this to the Anglosphere. I'm a white nationalist. I believe in white solidarity. When a white nation is attacked by a multiracial empire, I believe in coming to its defense. I think it's immoral to argue that we should be indifferent to the fate of other white nations because somehow we believe the destruction of Ukraine would make it easier for us to fix our own governments at home. Even if that were true, it's at best petty nationalism. It's not white nationalism. It's not what I stand for. Now, if you believe in white solidarity, then you should also want organizations in place to defend white nations from aggressors. And NATO happens to be performing that role right now, so I'm happy with that. Is NATO an anti-white geopolitical force as such? Well, when NATO was founded, most of its signatories were deeply racist nations. It was founded in 1949. The United States had an immigration policy committed to maintaining a white supermajority. It had segregation in the South. It was a white supremacist society. Germany based its citizenship on German blood. NATO wasn't the thing that changed all of these things. Those changes moved through different channels entirely. My friend James A. Argued recently in a piece that I reprinted at Countercurrents that NATO hasn't wrecked Poland, and not being in NATO has not saved Ireland. So to say that NATO is anti-white as such, I think is simply false. It was a defensive alliance to contain Soviet imperialism, and it has it admirably performed that role. And it is now relevant again because Russia is an aggressive imperialist power. And so I think it's doing good work. And since every nation within NATO is primarily white, they're majority white nations, they're all white homelands, I think NATO is an objectively pro-white institution right now. And I support it just to that extent. I do think, however, that it can be improved upon, and we'll deal with that in future questions. But that's a short answer.
Okay,
Greg keeps using the term imperialist power. There is no greater imperialist power in the world than the Judeo-American state, which operates on the basis of absolute blitzkrieg and total destruction when it attacked any nation. So I'm not sure why Greg is shilling so much for the American state and NATO, but then saying, oh, Russia is this great imperial power, when in fact the state that he's shilling for is far more of an imperialistic threat. Britain and America have done far more damage to nations post the end of the Soviet bloc than Russia has. And for Greg to then start claiming that NATO is some pro-white organization is to assume its member states are pro-white, which they are not. The majority of NATO member states are vassal states of America that stand for multiculturalism, unchecked mass immigration, and all the LGBT poison you could imagine, and probably some that you couldn't imagine. What's more, if you remember, NATO's last conflict in Europe was in fact the bombing of Serbia. NATO brutally attacked white Serbs for defending themselves against Islamic aggression in Kosovo. But Greg forgets that. I pointed that out in my opening salvo, where I stated that it was Russia who rolled into Serbia to defend white Serbs. NATO was happy to drop British and American bombs on white Serbian families who were trying to save part of their country from an aggressive Muslim breakaway state that were targeting Serbian families and Serbian children. And when the Serbs rose up and said, we're having enough of this, we're not putting up with this anymore, this is Serbia, it was NATO that bombed white people for standing up for themselves. And then it was Russia that came to the rescue of those white people. So you can LARP all you want, claiming that NATO is some great, almost nationalist bloc of pro-white nations standing up for some kind of great pro-white alliance. But is anything but. And I will tell you this now. Was any nation to try to forcibly remove large numbers of aggressive migrants, it would be NATO that would impose sanctions and potentially start bombing those white nations, just as they did with Serbia.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So the next question is on the Russian Federation, and it's similar to the NATO question. Is the Russian Federation anti-white? Obviously, the Russian Federation has official policies that seem to endorse multiculturalism and so on. That's a hot button issue. And also, is the Russian Federation therefore a anti-white force in the world? Is it a threat to pro-white politics in Eastern Europe? How do you guys perceive that? And again, Greg, you can jump in first, obviously.
I will grant that the Serbia thing was NATO's worst hour. NATO has also been involved in other sorts of regime change type operations, for instance, in Libya, which fall outside of its remit, by the way, but it's officially on paper a defensive alliance, and all of the member nations are majority white nations, and therefore, even if these majority white nations have anti-white governments, and most of them do, certainly the Western ones do, if these nations were attacked, the other nations would have to come to their aid, and therefore, even though it would be, of course, not the intention of Macron or somebody like that, or Boris Johnson or whoever's running the UK now, Liz Truss, to help white people, they would definitely be constrained to help white people. It would be the de facto prescribed course given the NATO Charter. Now, as for the Russian Federation, let me just say this. Is the Russian Federation anti-white? Yes, absolutely. It's anti-white in the same ways that we find our regimes anti-white. Russia is a multiracial empire in which the white majority has below replacement fertility, and the only growing populations are Chechens and Tuvans. Now, Russia also has large numbers of non-white immigrants from the stands who are more fertile than Russians. Millions of them have come in. For instance, I think it was in 2019, in the first part of 2019, 2.5 million of these people alone came in from the stands. the Central Asian countries that are not white. Now, as white nationalists, we all know what those trends mean in our own countries, and they mean the same thing in Russia. Unless these trends change, in a couple of centuries, the average Russian will be a Muslim with significant Mongoloid DNA. And the only way to preserve the Russian people is to do something like a Russian ethno-state, where they have control of their own borders and where they have pro-natal, pro-family policies, which the Russian state does not have. They have the highest abortion rate in the world. I think they've got the highest divorce rate in the world, and they have miserably below replacement fertility for the white majority and the Russian ethnic core. Now, in the West, we're more or less free to advocate for ethno-nationalism. Yes, we are inconvenienced by having our channels demonetized and losing platforms. I have been arrested under false pretenses and things like that. But that being the case, here I am. I'm still advocating for white nationalism. I can even advocate for Russian ethno-nationalism. But in Russia, that would get me gulagged as an advocate of caveman nationalism. Russia is an authoritarian society with an aggressively pro-multicultural, anti-nationalist propaganda in place. And short of revolution, there's no way of changing that. I talked earlier about my worst nightmare being a Trump dictatorship. Well, the Putin dictatorship would be like a Trump dictatorship. It is exactly the same thing. It basically turns countless potential right-wing dissidents into planned trusters who are going to embrace and make excuses for a regime that is committed to long-term white genocide, as long as that regime appeals to their conservative values and their authoritarian personalities. That is death for ethno-nationalism in Russia, and it would be death for ethno-nationalism in the United States and Australia and the UK as well. So I do not look favorably upon this regime. Francis Parker Yockey described the USSR as the leader of the outer revolt, the revolt of the non-white world against the white world. And Putin's recent speech that Mark was citing is direct from the Soviet anti-white, anti-colonial playbook. And Michael Tracy said it best. He said, "Who wrote this? Noam Chomsky." I do not think that Russia is a pro-white country. It might not be as stridently anti-white as some countries in the West, but the way their system is set up and the fact that their system does not allow the kinds of freedom of speech and political organizing by ethno-nationalists that I think is necessary to preserve our race means that in the long term, the results are going to be just as dire as the trends that are in place in America and the UK and Australia today. So yes, it's objectively anti-white, and it's worse than the anti-white system that we have in the West, because short of revolution, there's no way of changing it, because it's an authoritarian, illiberal, dictatorial regime.
Okay, Mark, your response?
Right, Greg is completely wrong on this. Russia is the largest country in the world. It's the largest landmass that is also a country. When you're dealing with a landmass of that size, you are going to get a natural state of multiculturalism where there are more than one different ethnic group living in that landmass. Now, I'll give you an example of natural multiculturalism. The British Isles is a state of natural multiculturalism, as there are the English, the Irish, the Scottish, and the Welsh. Now, they all happen to be white, but they are all different ethnic groups. They are all slightly different. When you look at them, you can see an Irishman and Englishman apart. They have their own languages, their own culture, their own ways of life, their own traditions. They are not the same. So that would be a natural state of multiculturalism for those different white tribes to live within the same area. Now, the British Isles is tiny. Russia is massive. You are going to get different ethnic groups living in any landmass of that size. And indeed, you do in Russia. You have white Russians, you have Chechens, you have Tatars, you have Cossacks, you have the people from Dagestan. But where Greg is misleading you is if you look at the Russian census data from 1926, then you look at the Russian census data right up to the last census in 2010, you will see the number of ethnic Russians has remained relatively stable at around 78 to 80% of the population. There has been, since 1926, no great decline in the number of white Russians living in Russia. However, in Britain, if you looked at the census data in Britain in 1926, you'd find out it was about 99.98% white British. Now it's around 80%. The drop-off you are seeing in Western nations, or the replacement rate you are seeing in Western nations, is far greater than you see in Russia. In Britain, white Britons at best are going to be a minority by 2066, probably much earlier. In America, a nation founded exclusively by white Europeans, that white Europeans in America are going to be a minority far sooner than white Britons. And as I said, white Russians at a stable rate. Now, Greg then goes on to say how oppressive Russia is. Well, yes, Russia has put certain nationalist groups behind bars. Those are usually violent street gangs run by people who, and this is no exaggeration, have made videos of themselves killing ethnic groups that naturally reside in Russia but aren't white, or actually capturing, torturing, and murdering gay men. Now, obviously, the Russian establishment is going to jail gangs that do things like that. The Russian establishment is going to jail gangs that do things like that. Now, I would say any nation would do that. Even Nazi Germany jailed people like Eamon Goeth from, the subject of the film Schindler's List. They make out that the Nazi regime actually loved him. They didn't. They jailed him. They stripped him of all his power and placed him in jail for his brutality. No regime would tolerate people doing things like that. But it's far worse in the West. And I'll give you examples of it in Britain. Nobody is jailed in Russia for misgendering people. Here in the UK, doors are kicked in at 3 a.m. in the morning. Women are dragged out of their homes in front of their children for tweeting to a man that he is in fact a man. Young lads get dragged off to jail for 2 years in Britain for buying the wrong book. These books are available on Amazon. Do not buy these books. I'm not telling you to buy these books. You certainly shouldn't. But young lads who have bought books available on Amazon, the state have jailed them for that. And the same is true in America. Just last week, we saw a Christian pastor and his family brutalized by the FBI for simply protesting against abortion. There are countless patriots who merely went into a building on January the 6th that are looking at federal charges. To claim the Russian state is more oppressive of people espousing common sense values is so laughable. I can't believe you even made that point. And also to claim that replacement migration is happening at the same level in Russia as it is in the West is nonsense. And what I'm saying is backed up by actual census data.
Okay, so the next question is going to be on, there seems to be like a dichotomy here for nationalists. On the one hand, nationalists, it would make sense why, on the face of it, why they would maybe have sympathy to Ukraine's right to national sovereignty, to self-determination. But then on the other hand, there are a lot of nationalist concerns with US/NATO power projection in Europe and the suppression of European nationalism in general by this arrangement. So, basically, which concern trumps the other?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, of course. That's how we're doing it. So.
Okay. Well, just a couple of things in response to Mark before I go into this, and I'll be brief. I don't think that we can base anything on Soviet censuses. A lot of things happened between 1926 and the end of the Soviet Union, like famines and the Second World War and things like that. I don't know if you can really trust the stats. The other thing is that to say that the percentage of the population is the same Today, as it was in 1926, it does not address the fact that differential fertility exists, that there are certain trends that are baked in, and then unless those trends are reversed, the Russian population will decline and be replaced by other people because they breed more, and they're also emigrating into Russia from other countries. And also, I did not say, you said that I said that the replacement migration was on the same level. I certainly didn't say that. But if there is any replacement immigration at all, eventually the same demographic consequences will pertain unless something is done about it. So we all recognize these problems in our own countries, and we should recognize them in Russia. However, if you're a Russian patriot, and not just a skinhead, not somebody who's going to be beating people up, but milquetoast immigration reformers, you will be gulagged for pointing these things out. We somehow are still broadcasting. We are not gulagged, even though we're horrible thought criminals. So yes, we have more freedom to advocate for the salvation of our race than comparable people do in Russia, which is why so many Russians with nationalist sympathies have fled to Ukraine. Now, your question was, as you formulated, does Ukraine's right to national sovereignty necessarily trump nationalist concerns with US NATO power protection? I guess my question is, whose nationalist concerns are you talking about? Are you talking about geopolitics here? Because when I hear that word, I reach for my pistol because I sense I'm about to be sold an argument that I can somehow advance white nationalism by giving verbal assent on the internet to something blatantly immoral, anti-white, and anti-nationalist. And I just don't like that. I don't do that. I would say yes, Ukraine's national sovereignty trumps geopolitical concerns with US power purely on principle, because the only geopolitics I want is a world of sovereign states. And that means if you want to get to a world of sovereign states, you defend the sovereign states that you've got today. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It is the only homeland of the Ukrainian people. And they want to keep it. And I certainly understand why they want to keep it. But if you don't care about a principled argument like that, if you think that's thinking too far into the future and so forth, let's just be cold and Machiavellian. The answer is still yes. Ukraine's independence is very important because Ukraine's a very special country. Why is it a special country? Because white ethno-nationalism is very strong there. It's very large. It's very well organized. There are some incredibly impressive Ukrainian nationalist parties and groups. Ukraine could be the first country in Europe to have a genuine ethno-nationalist regime someday. If Ukraine became part of NATO and the EU, it would be a natural ally of nations like Poland and Hungary against the worst influences of the West. It would be a natural ally of sensible people in NATO countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. And I would like those allies. I would certainly like to have Ukraine as an ally of Western nationalists rather than be defeated and quote unquote denazified by Putin's Antifa dictatorship. Now, Russia's apologists love to say that if a country joins NATO or the EU, it'll be flooded with non-whites and trannies. Ukraine, they say, would be doomed. Well, if it's really your position that countries like Ukraine or Poland or Hungary, with their large nationalist movements and stubbornly sensible populations, are doomed by NATO and the EU, what hope do Western nationalists have? If Svoboda and Azov and the National Corps can't beat back Western decadence, what chance does the NJP have? And if Orban can't beat the pause, then what chance does Patriotic Alternative have?
Mark?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so there's concerns on the face of it that nationalists would have towards Ukraine's national sovereignty. But at the same time, there's also concerns nationalists have in Europe towards American geopolitical and arguably imperial influence over Europe, suppressing nationalism in Europe. And so there's like a quandary. Whereas, what's the real concern here? The way Greg is selling it, obviously, is that, okay, so the Ukrainians, they need to have a right to self-determination. If we support their nationalism, that support is kind of morally consistent with our nationalism. Whereas the counter argument, which I presume you're going to have, is the opposite view, that actually, no, America, the American power structure that this would kind of facilitate is actually a much greater threat to nationalism.
Quite simply, this is a very easy question to answer. Actually, what's actually happening here is the idea of an independent Ukraine is actually what Russia wants. Russia wanted the Ukraine to be a buffer state between NATO, the EU, American influence, and Russia. Russia was happy for the Ukraine to remain independent and be a buffer state. Now, obviously, I am not going to say Russia never tried to influence any Ukrainian politicians, just as it would be foolish to say America didn't try to influence Ukrainian politicians. But it was an independent buffer state. It was neither part of the EU, nor NATO, nor the Russian Federation. The only time Ukrainian sovereignty has been threatened is when there was a CIA-backed revolution in 2014, a completely Jewish establishment, and a huge move to bring the Ukraine inside NATO and the EU. Now, if the Ukraine was being run by nationalists, which Greg seems to suggest it's this great nationalist country, those people would be saying, hey, let's get rid of this Zelensky fellow because he's taking us into NATO. He's taking us under the wing of American authority. He wants us as part of the EU. And we are already seeing the EU level fines and withholding money for countries like Poland, who firstly don't take enough migrants, and secondly aren't allowing the LGBT propaganda to be pushed as heavily within their institutions, within their schools, upon children in public places, etc. So I do want a genuinely sovereign Ukraine. That's why I want Judeo-American power to keep its hands off the Ukraine, especially the western parts of the Ukraine. Now, obviously, I said earlier, the Ukraine wasn't even a country until 1918, and it wasn't recognized fully as a country, I think, until 1991. And what has made up the Ukraine over time has constantly changed. So again, there are multiple ethnic groups living within the Ukraine's borders. Now, those people who are Ukrainian, who are ethnically Ukrainian, I am happy for them to have their self-determination, as am I happy for those in the East or those in Crimea to have their self-determination. And if they were once living in part of Russia and that part of Russia was then handed to the Ukraine in some Soviet redrawing of maps, I'm happy for them to vote to go back to being part of Russia as their ancestors were. That is only fair. For example, to draw an analogy, if all of a sudden England said, we want half of Scotland, and the Scots living there were like, well, hey, we'd rather live under Scottish rule. We're ethnically Scottish. We want to live with our brothers and sisters. You'd have to say, well, that is up to them. I think the best thing for the Ukrainians is self-determination. I think the best thing for the Germans is self-determination. I think the best thing for the French, the English, the Irish, Scots, and Welsh, it's all self-determination. But there is no self-determination being practiced in Western Europe. And I can prove this very, very simply. Look at the energy crisis in Germany. Look at the energy crisis in the UK. We are facing a situation where millions and millions of pensioners are at risk this Christmas of freezing to death. Now, if there was self-determination in Europe, the German government and the British government would be saying, well, look, we don't really have any dog in the fight in the Ukraine. It's really up to the Ukrainian people to choose their path in life, to choose their trajectory. But it's our choice to choose whether we buy cheap Russian gas in order that our people don't freeze. But there is no self-determination, because the Ukraine very soon, if Zelensky gets his ways, just like Britain and Germany have already gone down this path, will just become a vassal state of America. And then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you want to do or what's best for your people. All that matters, it's what's best for the American State Department. And what is best for the American State Department is fruitless sanctions against Russia. So yet again, Germans can starve and freeze at American hands. And this is what Greg calls a white nationalist bloc that helps white people. It doesn't. Self-determination means breaking free primarily of Judeo-American influence. And the Ukraine, had it not begun falling under Judeo-American influence, would still be an independent buffer state, which Putin would have been more than happy to observe.
Okay, so the next question that I want to ask, we've been talking a lot about kind of the ethics of the Ukraine-Russia dynamic and so on. But I want to talk about security, because obviously this is kind of there's also that kind of dimension to this. What security architecture ideally should exist in Europe and the West? Many argue, myself included, that there was a missed opportunity with not bringing the Russians in to a Western alliance and keeping NATO as an anti-Russian alliance, as opposed to a kind of West against the rest kind of alliance after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So what would be the ideal arrangement for European security architecture? Because on the one hand, you can say, well, within NATO, there's no brother wars in Europe. I mean, except for this one in particular. But other than that, Europe is united. Europe is secure because there's 7,000 American nukes pointed at anyone who wants to mess with anyone in the NATO alliance. And so there's supposedly a certain amount of security. But then on the other hand, people say, well, this has radically impacted European security, because now you have the potential for a nuclear exchange between the two world superpowers over a kind of dispute in Ukraine. So what would be your critique or whatever of that arrangement, and what would be your ideal arrangement? Maybe Mark can go first and Greg can go second. I don't know, change the order a little bit.
Sorry, can you just paraphrase that again then? If I'm going first.
Yeah, so I guess the way that I would put it kind of succinctly is, what would be the ideal, in your view, Western security architecture? Obviously, there's a lot of arguments. The argument for NATO is that it produces security for the West, right? So,
well, it doesn't.
What would be your alternative?
The ideal architecture is self-determination. I'm an ethno-nationalist. I believe that ethnic groups should seek self-determination. And when they have self-determination, they should be free to deal with other nations as they see fit. Now, I see since Russia has been supplying Europe with gas, there has been a closer relationship between Europe and Russia, especially between Germany and Russia. And this increased closeness should be something that we heralded as a good thing. It should have been something that showed security. It should have been something that showed cooperation. But this relationship has been constantly undermined by America. So as an ethno-nationalist, we want self-determination, but the right for individual nation states to be able to trade with one another to their mutual benefit. So we don't want to see nations forced to impose sanctions upon other nations when it's not good for them, or it's not in their interest, or they simply don't wish to do that. That is common sense. That is ethno-nationalism. That is freedom of choice and its self-determination. But everywhere in the world you look today, there are nations that could offer other nations things that they want. So take a look, I believe it's Venezuela, where the price of petrol is something like 2 pence a litre, which is obscenely cheap when you're looking that the price in the UK used to be 100 times that. It was almost £2 a litre a month or so ago. Well, why then isn't the UK free to buy Venezuelan oil? Because the UK doesn't have self-determination. It doesn't have the ability to go to Venezuela and buy oil. Because if it did, it would get slapped down by Big Daddy America that controls everything. And security largely comes not from having America pull everyone's strings, which is what has caused so many wars post the fall of the Berlin Wall. America has dragged, especially Britain, into these wars. It has destabilized nations, it has invaded nations, it's bombed nations, it's assassinated political and military leaders. That isn't security. That is tyranny. The Judeo-American state is the world tyranny. World security comes from dealing with people who you want to in a free and open manner without America leaning on you and preventing you from doing that. And every time a region moves slightly further towards peace and slightly further away from chaos, America steps in to ensure they redress that balance and the world falls closer to chaos. A great example of that is in Syria, where America wished to destabilize Syria using ISIS militants, which would have led to the deaths of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Christians at the hands of ISIS. Russia stopped that. Now, one of the reasons why I believe Russia is an important counterbalance to this Judeo-American tyranny is that recently we have seen that when America stopped Germany and Britain buying Russian gas, which puts all these white pensioners, all these white people on the poverty line at risk, India happily bought the gas. Now, do you think Russia is about to invade India? No. They're doing deals. That's self-determination. America's seething, but that's what people should be allowed to do. And I think security comes from self-determination and freedom to choose, freedom to do your own deals, and to cut your own path. When you start moving into these large geopolitical blocks that are controlled by tiny cliques of people who almost always seem to come from the same ethnic group, if you know what I mean, that is when you get closer to war, and that is where you get situations like we have seen post 1991, where you see American and Britain's imperialistic tendencies always acting for the benefit of a few to the detriment of the many.
Okay, so Greg, your response, unless you need me to restate anything.
No, I have it written down here. Basically, the question that I saw formulated in my notes is, can NATO or should NATO be reformed? And what would be the ideal Western security architecture? I can answer that very briefly. Before I do that, I want to mention a couple of things about self-determination. A nation does not have self-determination if its neighbor can veto its foreign relations. A buffer state does not have self-determination. Ukraine very, very clearly since 1991 has pursued closer relations with the EU. They want to be part of Europe. This is the popular view in Ukraine. It's not been foisted upon them. Russia has tried to maintain, turn Ukraine into a dependent satellite state like Belarus. Okay, the self-determination of the Ukrainian people would allow them to choose the EU or NATO. If they can't choose the EU or NATO, they don't have self-determination. Russia had tried to prevent them from entering the EU to the extent of economic sanctions in 2013. Then basically, through shocking corruption, they basically just bought Yanukovych's about face on this. And that's what caused the Maidan revolution. It was not a US op. It was a popular uprising against a very cynical operation from Moscow to prevent the country from pursuing EU membership, which had been very much a consensus for more than a decade. So you can't be a sovereign nation if you're somebody's buffer state or satellite. And the Ukrainians didn't want to be like Belarus. They wanted to move closer to the West. And they obviously wanted to move closer to NATO because, as I said, if they were members of NATO, they never would have been invaded like this. NATO would have provided them cover. And I can see why it's rational for them to want to get into NATO and the EU, even though NATO and the EU have lots of strings and lots of problems. However, I would look upon a country like Ukraine in the same way that I look upon a country like Poland and Hungary. In the EU, they are a force for good. In NATO, they are a force for good. And yes, it turns out that the EU does cut their allowance for resisting things like refugee resettlement and so forth. But that is merely a paring back of their allowance. They get billions and billions of dollars in infrastructural aid and things like that. And then they get their allowance docked. They're willing to deal with that in order to push back and preserve their common sense, basically. And I think that that would be great if Ukraine got involved and did the same thing. It would help push these organizations in a better direction. But it's rational for them to want to get in, even with all of the problems, because it's a better alternative to being a Belarus-style kleptocratic satellite of Russia. Now, can NATO be reformed? Of course NATO can be reformed. There are all kinds of bad things about NATO. The worst thing is probably that NATO has encouraged the militaries and martial spirits of most of its members to atrophy. Finland and Sweden have great militaries, actually, and if they get into NATO, that could actually harm them. I hope they can resist that. And also, NATO has been used by the United States to get Jewish-penned free speech violations adopted by new member countries. For instance, I remember there was a big row about this in Romania. Romania can't honor Marshal Antonescu because that upsets American Jews. NATO was actually in a position, or the United States was actually in a position where they would have denied NATO entry to countries that adopted the American Bill of Rights. It's that stupid. It's that crazy. These are obviously bad things, but they're hardly the apocalyptic predictions that Russian propagandists come up with. And there's certainly nothing compared to the tyranny exercised within the Warsaw Pact and the USSR proper, which is what these countries in the East remember. This is why 15 former Soviet nations entered NATO. They did it voluntarily. They weren't conquered. Okay. Now, I think NATO would be great if every NATO member country had a pro-white leadership. It would be perfect. Same with the EU. If we suddenly had pro-white leaders in every country, those organizations could be turned around overnight and they would be much better. To make that happen, that's up to every nationalist movement in every NATO country. And of course, I think they could use some allies, sensible countries like Ukraine coming into NATO, sensible countries like Poland and Hungary already in NATO. That could help the UK, I think, accomplish better leadership. Now, short of that, and that's sort of a long shot given how messed up the West is.
Gone over 5 minutes, by the way.
Okay, well, let me just say I've got 2 sentences.
I'll get you to go back to back. I'll bring in the other question.
Okay.
The final question is, with the risks associated with the conflict escalating, obviously, the threat of nuclear war is particularly concerning. Yeah. The energy crisis gripping Europe, and also the potential for the Russian Federation to collapse if Ukraine were to have a decisive victory, and that would only kind of exacerbate the risks of, I think, military escalation and so on. How is that handled? I want to bring all of that in as well. What kind of policies should pro-white or nationalist forces in the Anglosphere and Western Europe be advocating for in regards to both the war and Russia generally? Because we're seeing, some people on Twitter, like libtard talking heads that are advocating for NATO to enter the war, for example, if the Russians have a decisive victory, to save Ukraine. We're seeing people advocating for the breakup of the Russian Federation, and trying to impose its dissolution and so on. I think all of this stuff is incredibly risky considering the nuclear architecture. So to bring that into the debate, I'd like to get your thoughts. Greg, you've got another 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mark.
Yeah. Okay. So, short of every NATO country having a nationalist government, I think more reasonably, the Central and Eastern European countries should try and create an intermarium alliance. This is something that Countercurrents has been promoting since 2015. It's an old idea. It was a Polish interwar geopolitical idea of basically creating a bloc that would go from the Baltic to the Black Sea, following the lines of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a sort of cordon sanitaire against Bolshevism to save Europe from Bolshevism. Something like that makes sense in Central and Eastern Europe today because it would address these countries' security concerns vis-a-vis Russia, but also make it independent of the West. I think that might be an excellent alternative to NATO and the EU in the long run. And something like that might happen if tensions within NATO and the EU between the sensible countries and the crazed countries become unbearable. Southern Europe also needs some kind of agreement to seal off the continent from Africa and the Near East. So these things all need to be explored somehow. As for the risks that we're facing, well, I mean, honestly, I think economic instability can only help nationalists. So I don't know if this is really a bad thing. I think a lot of the economic instability that we're facing right now is actually simply caused by COVID, COVID spending and COVID disruptions. And I think one reason that a lot of Western powers went all in on this Ukraine war is so that they can blame the COVID recession on Putin entirely and get off the hook. But I do think economic instability is an opportunity for us, and it's something that we shouldn't be lamenting, perfectly honestly. There is a terrible danger of nuclear escalation. I don't know how to stop that. Frankly, I guess we could stop listening to crazed libtards on Twitter. That might help. I don't really know if I care about the Russian Federation breaking up. As an ethno-nationalist, I look at it as a prison house of nations. I don't see why the Chechens and the Dagestanis and all these other people shouldn't have their own states. I do think, though, that if it happened in a willy-nilly way, simply because of the collapse of the regime, that what that would open up is the possibility of China annexing all of the East. And the idea of all the resources of Siberia joined with China's population is profoundly chilling. I'll start talking about geopolitics now when I contemplate something like that. How to end this war? Well, I think we should give Ukraine the best weapons as quickly as possible and allow them to continue their momentum of pushing Russians back. At a certain point, I think that the Russians will want to make a deal, because I think that this has destabilized Putin's regime. It's shown Russia to be a paper tiger, and it's going to cause a great deal of instability all over the former Russian sphere. We've already seen border wars in the stands, a border war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's a lot of instability that's being opened up by the fact that Russia has performed so weakly. And I hope that they will want to de-escalate this. What the ultimate settlement will be, I don't know. I don't think Ukraine is ever going to get Crimea back. But I think they should just look on the bright side and say, well, they've lost a lot of ethnic Russians who won't be voting in their elections. And they should try and hold on to what they can in the East. And the ultimate resolution of the ethnic conflicts in the East should probably be solved simply by moving peoples rather than moving borders. I do not think that a very substantial percentage of ethnic Russians in the East actually want to be in Russia. And the ones who really want to go should be allowed to. I don't think the referenda can be taken seriously when you basically have a referendum that is done after ethnic cleansing under military occupation. There were referenda after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think we should let those referenda stand.
Okay, Mark, you got the
You ready? Yeah. Well, Greg said earlier that his point is, wouldn't it be great if NATO was actually all pro-white and everyone in NATO was pro-white, and then everything would be good? Well, that isn't the case, is it? In fact, every country that has entered NATO has been pressured to be less pro-white. And you're saying if the remaining pro-white nations enter NATO, that will somehow realign NATO. No, it won't. They will just be pressured to be less pro-white, to be more pro-migrant, to be more pro-LGBT. And every time anybody is pro-Russian in any way or pro-neutrality, Greg always states these people are being paid by Russia. But he seems to totally lack the ability to understand that people who are pro-US, people who are pro-NATO, people who are pro this war in the Ukraine this is a wacky idea, Greg, but maybe, just maybe, America has used some of its trillions of dollars in wealth to pay those people too. And I would suggest that there has been far more CIA meddling in the Ukraine. And we know this from some of the leaks, from the Hunter Biden leaks, the Joe Biden leaks, stuff that came out before the last presidential election, to what America was doing in the Ukraine. The idea that all of these people who are pro-American in the Ukraine are just seeking self-determination is nonsense. They have been paid off. They are stooges. And I would say no nation in the world, and I would bet my life on this, other than Israel, no Western nation has done more when it comes to subterfuge and the undermining of national sovereignty than America. And as I said, there's only one nation that does that more, and that is Israel. Now, of course, I am bothered about nuclear escalation, and I was pleased when Greg said that he was bothered about nuclear escalation. Now, I'm going to suggest something here because I've only got a few minutes left. But if you want to know all about how this began, there is a great presentation on YouTube by a guy called John Mersheimer. It's absolutely wonderful. He goes back to the 2008 Bucharest summit. He has evidence which says America and the American State Department knew that if they pursued this tactic in the Ukraine, it would lead to this. And one of their outcomes that they discussed was nuclear war. So America have gone down this road knowing that nuclear war could be an outcome, because these people are maniacs. The people in charge of the State Department, they don't care what happens next. Now, Greg also said he doesn't care if the Russian Federation breaks up. Again, absolute insanity. The Russian Federation and the BRICS bloc are the counterbalance to Judeo-American Western liberal democracy. If there is no counterbalance to the American state and to those Judeo-American values, that places all the power in the world in the hands of those people. Anybody who thinks placing all the world's power in one group of people who just happen to be the most anti-white group of people, the most pro-diversity group of people, the most pro-Israel group of people, and the most degenerate, debased, pro-LGBT, pro-transgender, anti-family, anti-Christian, anti-morality. If you want to place all the world's power in their hands without any massive counterbalance or any real counterbalance at all, you're insane, because they would escalate their plan for white genocide at an exponential rate. And finally, and this is where I completely lose what Greg is saying, in its entirety. I think Greg has gone absolutely insane, actually. Because when Greg says, how do you want to bring about the end to this war? My answer would be Western nations should seek self-determination and stop giving billions and billions and billions of dollars or pounds worth of high-tech weaponry to the Ukraine. Because if that weaponry was cut off at source, the war would be over in a week or so. The only reason the Ukraine is still fighting over the east, the only reason there is still bloodshed, is because the Western military-industrial complex is funding that war. Western politicians are getting rich off that war. Arms manufacturers are getting rich off that war. cut off those resources. By doing the Gregg plan and giving them more weapons, that will extend the war. There will be more bloodshed, there will be more white people dead, and if Russia get pushed back more and more, and if the war gets hotter and hotter, the Gregg plan will take us closer to nuclear war. The only way to de-escalate now is for Western nations to do what Gregg says he wants Western nations to do, but Gregg doesn't really want Western nations to do this. Gregg wants Western nations to do what America wants, but I want Western nations to seek self-determination. Self-determination for Britain is not billions for the Ukraine while Brits freeze. It's billions for British pensioners and billions of Russian gas so that our elderly people and our people on the poverty line don't die. It's not billions more of high-tech weaponry taking us closer and closer and closer to 12 o'clock on the doomsday clock. Midnight on the doomsday clock, it's game over for everyone, because when those nukes start flying, it is mutually assured destruction. That would be disastrous. But giving more weapons to Ukraine and extending this war takes us closer to that midnight hour. The time has come for Western nations to break away from American influence, seek self-determination, do what trade deals they wish, and stop pumping billions of taxpayers' money into prolonging this fratricidal war.
Okay, thanks, guys. That was a pretty good debate. I think a lot of the substantive points in the issue were kind of covered. And the audience got, I think, a pretty good representation of the two views. So I think it's been a success. Now you guys are welcome to leave if you have to go, but I'm just going to start going through some of these super chats. Now the first super chat is from Flying Dutchman, and he's addressing Greg. He says, Dr. Johnson, you're on record saying that you're a Zionist because Jews need to have their own homeland. Is Zionism compatible with white nationalism if Zionist funds are accepted by white nationalists? Thank you both for the discussion.
Well, I don't know what that last bit was about, but I'm a consistent ethno-nationalist, and yeah, that makes me a Zionist. I would like Jews to have their own homeland, and what's more, I'd like them all to actually live there. And I think that that would be the solution to the Jewish question, the Jewish problem. As far as money coming from them, well, no, I think we should try and avoid any kind of financial entanglements with these people because, well, they're masters at pursuing their own interests at the expense of others. I fully recognize that the basic Jewish position that most Jews have is nationalism for us, but not for the rest of the world. And they're never going to play fair unless we force them to play fair.
I've only got one thing to say on this. I've just made a video about this actually on Friday. It's a 10-minute video. Zionism is a cancer. Zionism is not Jewish nationalism, it's Jewish supremacism. And Zionism has two distinct yet hypocritical components. One is that Jews deserve an ethno-state where they are first-class citizens, where they are ethnically protected, where they protect their own culture, their own traditions, their own religion. But at the same time, Zionists who control the West, people like Liz Truss, Joe Biden, both are admitted Zionists, do the exact opposite to Western nations. So Zionism seeks to create ethnic homogeny for one group, to protect that group and grant that group a special power and a special right, whilst stripping everybody else of that right and dumping everyone else into a multicultural melting pot so that they lose who they are and the strength that comes from ethnic homogeny and from holding on to your culture and traditions. I am not a Zionist, and I think Zionism is one of the most destructive forces the world has ever known.
Do you think that Jews should have a homeland of their own?
I think Jews should have a place where they can live together. And yes, that would be a homeland. But I do not think that homeland should come at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian people who have been slaughtered, who have been maimed, who have been brutalized, and who have been driven off their land in the most brutal and disgusting way. And I will further what I've just said with the fact that had any other ethnic group other than the Jews treated another ethnic group in the way that the Palestinians have been treated, there would have been bombs flying everywhere. But they get away with everything. And what they have done to the Palestinian people is nothing short of genocide.
So
would you
where
support
where
like
would
a
this
two-state
Jewish state
solution
be then?
with like 1967, pre-1967 borders, or would you move? Would you ideally have the state completely somewhere else?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, just out of curiosity.
I think that there has to be a massive expansion of Palestinian land. There has to be a return of Palestinian land that has been illegally seized by Jewish settlers. And whatever arrangement they come to, it cannot be a situation where Palestinians are brutalized and all power is seized from them. So, as I say, I am not against any ethnic group seeking self-determination, but self-determination should be for all, not for one chosen people.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the next super chat, which is from Kevin McLean. He said Russia has for 800 years been a multi-ethnic country incorporating Slavic, Turkic, Ugarian, and East Asian peoples, but the population has remained in balance, with Russians maintaining an 80% majority. It's more of a comment, I guess, than a question, but I don't know if either of you dispute that. I think actually, Mark, you made that point yourself. I'm not super aware of the history, to be honest.
If it's you can't tell the future from a snapshot, looking at percentages without looking at fertility rates. And white Russians will not be 80% of the Russian Federation with 1.5 fertility, when other groups like Chechens and Tuvans are actually have population growth. So if you look at it over a very long period of time, it's simply impossible for them to maintain that 80%. Also, there are no boundaries against miscegenation in the Russian Federation, and quite a lot of it has taken place already. And again, there are literally millions of people from the stands who are there as immigrants, legal and illegal, who are also breeding. And so, yeah, in the long run, I think Russia has alarming demographic trends, just like the United States does, just like Great Britain does, just like other countries do. And they have an illiberal government that will not allow people to frame these concerns and get them debated in politics. So I think that not only do they have the same problem as we do in the West, but they don't have the ability for patriotic people with a long-range vision to try and turn it around. And that's a terribly dangerous situation for Russians and for any other people in the Russian Empire, for that matter.
Well, I've already made my point about Russia. The number of white Russians or the percentage of white Russians in Russia has remained remarkably stable since 1926. Again, Greg then says, oh, well, you can't trust any Russian statistics. Well, can you trust any statistics the British government give you? Can you trust any statistics the American government give you? If you're playing that game, you could say, well, actually, white Britons are far closer to ethnic annihilation than we think because they've been fiddling the censuses. The same argument can be made at both sides. Now, I can't change any of the breeding habits of people. That's beyond my power. But Greg makes a very strange comment that there are no laws in Russia against miscegenation. Well, there's no laws against miscegenation in the West either, Greg. In fact,
I know, this is a problem
miscegenation is essentially forced in the West. Every single advert or every single TV show or film you see in the West is pro-miscegenation. Now, in Russia, when you look at adverts, when you look at television, what is being forced on Russian people? It is not the same white genocide as being forced in the West. And to say it is quite frankly delusional. If you look at the makeup of people on Russian TV, there is no concerted effort to make sure every blonde-haired, blue-eyed white Russian woman is paired with an African migrant. That is happening in the West, and there is a concerted effort. I've been documenting this in Christmas adverts since about 2017.
Yeah, it's much worse in the West. It's terrible. There's this hilarious video clip that I saw of Lukashenko in Belarus lauding miscegenation between Belarusian girls and Arabs and Egyptians and people like that. So it happens there too. Also, Russia has very aggressive multicultural propaganda where they have people popping up, one of each. It's like the cover of an American college catalog popping up. I'm Russian, you know, Tuvans and Kalmucks and people like that. They do have that same kind of propaganda. But here's the thing. No matter how the propaganda is pitched, whether it's screamingly anti-white or even sort of conservative and wholesome, the underlying demographic problem is there. And if it's not addressed in a timely fashion, it's going to lead to the same conclusions. And that's the sad thing. You can have a conservative, Christian-branded, civic nationalist melting pot kind of society that's just as anti-white as in its long-term demographic consequences as the crazed nonsense that you and I have to live with in the West. That's the sad truth about Russia.
Well, I fundamentally disagree, and I will say this. You keep pointing out the multiculturalism of Russia, but as I said, it is a massive landmass with multiple ethnic groups living within it, just as the British Isles has a natural multiculturalism.
It's an empire, and it should downsize. It needs to downsize. It needs to shed some of its diversity.
Well,
That's
maybe
the
to shed some of its diversity. Maybe the ethnic Russians in the east of the Ukraine need to.
I think that they should start migrating to Russia. It would help Russia's terrible demographic problems. But you know, there's another thing that I just want to address, which is this counterbalance idea that you were putting forward. First of all, Russia is a very weak cardboard counterbalance to the West, as we have discovered. It's quite fragile. Its military has performed miserably. There have been, I think, as many as 4.5 million Russians have fled the country since September 24th. I've seen wildly varied figures. It is not a very powerful counterbalance, and it's certainly not as powerful a counterbalance as, say, China. If Russia folds like a cheap suit, and it very well might, China is still going to be a major player on the global stage. India is still a major player on the global stage, just in terms of population. It is not going to be this catastrophic image that you paint of the United States being able to get its way in everything if Russia folds. So I don't accept that. And at what price are we willing to contemplate creating this counterbalance? You know, are we going to offer up, how many white nations should be offered up as burnt offerings on the altar of geopolitics against American hegemony? I would say zero.
Why do you want American hegemony?
I don't want American hegemony.
Good, then support a genuine independent buffer state. Tell America to get out of the Ukraine. Russia then would have no need to go into the Ukraine. America knew, if you watch John Mersheimer's speech, he explains all of this in great detail. After the Bucharest summit in 2008, America knew what would happen if they pursued this route. America have pursued this route because they want regime change in Russia. And without being insulting, what you are seeing in terms of the Russia offensive, you clearly don't understand, The Russian offensive had a mere 190,000 troops involved, and it did not follow the path of blitzkrieg or shock and awe. Putin has not gone in there like America or Britain would have done and completely flattened the nation, then rolled in when it was rubble and dust, because he is clearly doing this to cause as little damage as
I think that's
possible.
really laughable. I've seen the
How is
ruins
it
of
laughable?
Mariupol. I think it's easy enough to Google the burned out ruins of. He's destroyed a lot of the area in the Donbass.
He's done nothing compared. Google, Greg, if you're going to do this, you need some facts, because there was about 220,000 Iraqi civilians killed by America and Britain by direct violence alone. So that means by shells, bombs, missiles, bullets, artillery. There has been nothing like that kind of civilian loss in the Ukraine. And by the end of the Iraq conflict, when you took into account deaths because of the destruction of healthcare facilities, infrastructure, water, nearly 1 million Iraqi civilians had died. And was it Victoria Nuland or someone else who said, well, that's just an acceptable price?
I think that was another Jew, Madeleine Albright.
Another one. Well, yeah. You're certainly fighting their corner tonight, Greg, with your positions. But the fact of the matter is, Putin has not brought anywhere near that level of devastation upon the Ukraine. He could have done if he'd have wanted to. He is absolutely capable of it. Not everybody who commands a military force uses it in the same way as the vicious, soulless warmongers behind the American State Department, which for some reason you seem to be a big fan of, and I am absolutely not.
No, not a big fan of the American State Department. However, I see why countries like Ukraine are fans of things like NATO and are seeking out influence in Washington. They're looking for a counterbalance, right? They're looking for a counterbalance against Russia. They don't want to be sucked into being basically a kleptocratic satellite like Lukashenko's Belarus. This is just political realism. That's just what small nations do.
You can't have it both ways, Greg. It's either self-determination or they're joining up with America. Which is it?
Self-determination. You can be, it's perfectly consistent with being a sovereign state to enter into voluntary alliances with other nations. That's completely consistent with being a sovereign state. And that's exactly what NATO is. NATO was not created by conquest, unlike the Warsaw Pact. It was not created by conquest. Countries enter into it, they apply, they are voted on, and they are brought in or not. And if you want to say there's no difference between conquest and that, then I beg to differ. There are enormous differences. There are morally relevant differences between sovereign nations joining together in alliances with one another, or sovereign nations being conquered and basically turned into vassals by others. I do not accept this language of calling, say, Ukraine a vassal state of the United States. It's not a conquest that's taking
Is the
place.
UK a vassal state of the United States?
Well, let me ask you.
There's only one answer to this, Greg.
You tell me.
Of course it is. The UK doesn't even have power over its own nuclear arsenal. America does. The UK is a complete vassal state of America, just as Germany is. And that
Airstrip one. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, okay. The UK is a vassal state of the. Do you think the UK would be allowed to resign its position in NATO?
Absolutely not. The UK is completely.
What would be done? What would be done? Would bombs be dropped?
It would never happen.
London?
It would never. You would never get a situation if the UK tried to break away from NATO or tried to break away from American control. The first thing would happen is all their nuclear submarines would immediately stop functioning. or at least the warheads would be disabled and would just be basically useless to them. The fact is, the UK is basically, one of America's fighting arms. It has been for some time. It was completely bought and co-opted post Second World War.
It's a sad decline for your empire. There's no question about it. Are there other super chats here?
Yeah, I'll move on to Flying Dutchman sent another one saying freedom of speech and certain political parties have also been crushed in Ukraine. I think this is actually a good point. I mean, this idea that like Russia's this super oppressive, autocratic state, but Ukraine is this bastion of liberal democracy. I mean, surely, Greg, you don't actually buy this.
Well, Ukraine does have a multi-party parliamentary system that's much less farcical than what happens in Russia. But yeah, one of the reasons why there have been these parties that have been shut down is because it's easy for parties to be set up, including parties that are simply basically tools of Russian power. And those are the kinds of parties that have been shut down. So
yeah, but weren't some of these parties that were like connected to the Russians incredibly popular, particularly in the regions that the Russians have annexed? If you look at like the voting trends prior to 2014, a lot of parties and figures which are considered pro-Russian and validly so would often win those elections.
Well, yes, indeed, they had a series of pro-Russian presidents. But what happened is once they got into office, they had to deal with a genuine multi-party democracy, and a very, very substantial percentage of Ukrainians didn't want to go that way. So
yeah, but the percentage of the Ukrainians that seem to want to go in that pro-Russian route seem to be the Ukrainians, particularly in Luhansk and Donetsk, if you look at the voting history. Now, obviously, just because they voted for pro-Russian parties doesn't necessarily mean that they would want to be annexed by the Russian Federation.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are two different things, but it definitely demonstrates, nevertheless, that these people have had, since 2014, they've been suppressed from exercising their rights in these areas. The Minsk agreements were violated. There's no question about it. Independent international observers have pointed that out. So surely you have to at least acknowledge that the Ukrainians, they're hardly, without any moral blame in the situation. There does seem to be a pro-Russian element and a Russian ethnic element that exists in these territories, which has been politically suppressed in multiple ways by the Ukrainian state, and international agreements have been violated, surely, around this as well. So.
It would be nice if all of this could be sorted out. I don't think it can be sorted out until there's an end to this war.
But Greg, you can't have it both ways.
Isn't the war itself trying to like an expression of the fact that it couldn't be sorted out? I mean,
I don't know.
One of the key kind of causes.
Look, I want to say, Greg, you've given your point. I just want to give this rebuttal to what you said. You keep wanting to have it both ways. So when there's someone who is speaks out on Russia's side, they're bought and paid for by the Russians. When somebody speaks out on the American side, that's just that person giving their opinion. And now what you're saying is there's no freedom in Russia, but there's loads of freedom in the Ukraine. And then when somebody says, what about all the pro-Russian parties that have been banned, parties that get a sizable number of the votes, parties that represented hundreds of thousands of people in the east of the Ukraine have just been banned by Zelensky, you say, oh, well, that's okay, because they were pro-Russian. So what you're basically saying...
Look, it's a war. Okay, it's a
but
war.
no, you can't have it both ways. Greg. You can't say self-determination. Ban that party because it's saying something I don't like. You can't say it both ways. And that's what you're doing.
Look. If you're at war with another country, you cannot. No serious country at war with another country is going to allow political parties that work for your enemy to enjoy.
They were banned before this conflict.
To sit
they
down
were banned before.
When did the conflict start? When was the first political party banned? What year?
I would have to look that up, but there have been numerous parties banned, and they were banned before the operations that started this year. And obviously
Were they banned after 2014?
Yes.
Okay, well, the war started in 2014 as far as the Ukrainians are concerned.
Oh,
That's when Crimea
so-
was annexed. That's when the Donetsk and Luhansk ops took off. If you see that there are political actors in your society that are in the pay of a hostile foreign power that has actually taken your territory, it would be completely farcical to let these people be seated in your parliament and engage in
but they're being voted
political
in
deliberation
by people in the east of the Ukraine who deserve a voice in parliament. Because you keep saying self-determination, self-determination. Then eventually, when the self-determination doesn't work out the way Greg Johnson and Countercurrents wants it to work out, ban them.
Are there other questions?
There are. I just thought this was kind of interesting. This seems to be one of the kind of key issues. But yeah, so we also have a question from Thumprat. Is Mark unaware the 23-year-old Russian woman was charged and put on an extremist list for posting memes about black people on VK? Okay, whatever. Hackman says to Greg, Ukraine is run by a US-planted Jewish homo. What reason do we have to think that that would improve by Ukraine joining NATO? To Mark, say something nice about Greg. To all, nukes are fake and gay.
Say something nice about Greg. He publishes an excellent book called The Enemy of the Europe by Francis Parker Yockey. You should all buy it and read it and understand that the real enemy is Western liberal democracy.
Okay, that's very kind of you. I'm going to watch the sales of that skyrocket. So,
Archie says, great discussion, guys. I'll keep it to myself who I believe wins. The most important thing is to avoid the nukes. I mocked the fears that Putin was going to invade. I was fooled. I don't doubt the nuke threats. I missed the first hour. Hope I can listen from the beginning and share it. Thanks, Archie. Flying Dutchman again says, one thing we should all agree upon is the resiliency of the white race, whether you live in the West or Russia. The only way to our salvation is the third rail. I think that probably goes without requirement for comment. Gadius Maximus says, if the UK is just a vassal state and everything is hopeless, what exactly is the point of PA, Mark? Why do anything?
I didn't say everything was hopeless. I said that the UK has been reduced to a vassal state of America. That is something I absolutely wish to overturn. I want to see the American, Judeo-American system crumble. And I think if the Judeo-American system did crumble, I believe that states under the control of that system could begin to then take their own destiny back into their hands. Then there would be self-determination, and that's what I fight for. I want a genuinely independent Britain, and equally I want to see a genuinely independent Germany, France, etc. I don't want European nations to be vassal states of America. That's what I'm fighting for. I think that's pretty clear from what I've said tonight.
Yeah, Archie said MAGA is a party that's trying to form in the USA, but the Biden regime is trying to shut it down just as Great Britain won't let patriotic alternative form. Liberal democracy is an illusion. It's fascist. I feel like it's a bit of a blue-pilled comment, but thanks. Nice sentiment, I guess. Zoltanus says, Greg, if Russian Empire is bad, why has it always existed in Russian identity? Also saying it must go away is asking Russian identity to die. Konstantin Rozaevsky, the Russian fascist in ABC of Fascism, said it was the spiritual unity of every ethnic group. Russian identity is distinct for this reason.
Yeah, well, I think that it would be nice that the Russian people have a homeland of their own. And the main impediment to having a homeland of their own is the Russian imperialist ideology of Russia's elite. Again, the idea that this is an existential war, that Russia cannot exist behind its 2013 borders is absurd unless unless the Russian mentality is defining itself as imperialistic. Then it is an existential threat. It's an existential threat to the Russian imperialist mentality to live behind its borders. But I want a world where there are distinct nations that can live behind their borders in peace with one another. And that kind of imperialist mentality is inconsistent with my long-term ethno-nationalist geopolitical vision, which is why I want to comment on this kind of stuff, because I think that if we put forward this vision of a world where different peoples can live in peace with one another behind stable borders and cooperate, that is a superior vision to the world that we have today, where you have multiracial empires, you've got multiculturalism, you've got mass migration, you've got the destruction of identity, and you've got parasitic groups that are benefiting from that, whether that's the elite in Moscow or whether it's international Jewry or whether that's sort of the globalist establishment in America. There are many different sort of market dominant minorities and elites that skim off and benefit from imperialism and globalization in one form or another, even though that's destructive of identities and destructive of other nations. I'd like an alternative world order to that. That's the reason to comment on this. I think that if we had an ethno-nationalist world order, there wouldn't be this war in Ukraine.
Archie said, Greg said war is a justified reason to shut down the opposition. We don't need a war to silence the opposition. COVID emergency measures were enough to attack the Canadian freedom truckers. I don't know if we want to start
emergency powers are a grave danger, right? War emergencies, health emergencies. People say, well, it's an emergency. We can change the rules arbitrarily, and that is a great danger. That's how.
Yeah, but Greg, as an ethno-nationalist, if for sake of argument, if it was demonstrated that in the Donbass, the people there were overwhelmingly ethnically Russian. Obviously, there's a historical link between that region and Russia. If they voted to secede, and it was a kind of fair election and so on, and there could be there was international observers that were neutral that verified it, would you accept the results?
Absolutely. That's one way that you can handle these things. Now, there was a referendum about whether to be ruled from Moscow or ruled from Kiev. It was after the collapse of communism, and every single region of Ukraine voted for independence. Even the Donbass, even the Crimea. The Crimea had the lowest percentage, but it was still over 50%. Those were referendums that were actually observed by outsiders. Those were referendums that were probably as free and fair as you're going to get in a place like that. What's happened since then, for instance, the obviously fake referendum that took place in 2014 in Crimea, that was ratified by foreign nationalist observers who are obviously enamored of Putin. That was fake. Certainly, the referenda that have taken place in the East recently, where Ukrainians have fled the area because, well, they're afraid of dying, where armed men go door to door collecting votes. Clearly, that's a fake referendum, and that cannot be taken seriously. But yes, it would be great if you could have referenda that that could separate certain territories where there's ethnic conflict. Like I said, the only referendum that I know of that took place under those conditions soundly kept those areas as part of Ukraine. Now, if things have changed radically since then, I would be surprised. Here's the thing. I believe that every distinct people should have a homeland. That doesn't mean that every ethnic Russian needs to live in Russia, right? Or every ethnic German needs to live in Germany. But if you've got a homeland and you feel very strongly about it, it's great for the Russians to have a homeland that they can go to. Many, many ethnic Russians live in Ukraine and felt no need to pack up and move to Russia. A lot of ethnic Russian, I know ethnic Russians in Ukraine who fled Russia to Ukraine because they found it a freer place to live. So just to say that because somebody is an ethnic Russian, that they're a natural voter for secession is highly dubious. And therefore, you really do need to have some kind of fair referendum. How you could have it at this point after 8 years of conflict in this region, I don't know. And maybe the best way to sort this out is just to allow people who feel very, very strongly about being ruled from Moscow to move across the border. I think that if you gave them that choice, very few would actually do it. I think that the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics are simply Russian military operations. They're fake. And Russia has a history of these kinds of operations. The Transnistria op, which happened in Moldova, is an example of this. They like to use Russian populations that were left over in various parts of the Soviet Empire and Russian Empire as pretext, as a fifth column for Russian influence and as a pretext for various ops and interventions. So there's a long history of that. And I think that Ukrainians, therefore, regard this with extreme jaundice. But let's just leave that aside. I do think that the solution to ethnic conflict when you have multiple peoples within the same borders is to move borders or move people or both.
I just want to respond to this. I think what Greg said is utter nonsense. Everything that doesn't go Greg's way is somehow controlled by the Russians. But things that do go Greg's way are absolutely self-determination. So in 2014, what was clearly a CIA-backed coup was absolutely the will of the Ukrainian people. But isn't it interesting?
It wasn't a CIA-backed coup.
It was a CIA-backed color revolution
what color was it?
Hey, Greg, I think Mark let you speak for a while, so you should
which
let
was
him
pushed
make.
through to depose Viktor Yanukovych because Viktor Yanukovych was not going along with American interests. The people who were armed and used as a battering ram to push that revolution through, many of them were arrested afterwards, and none of them ended up holding any form of power in the new reconstructed Ukraine, because those people mainly were angry nationalists who had been used by the CIA as a battering ram. Just as Azov have been used by the CIA to commit war crimes in eastern Ukraine, again, as a battering ram to provoke Russia. That was a coup. That was not democracy. You cannot say that a CIA-backed coup is somehow more good or more proper or more an indication of self-determination than a series of referenda by people who have lived in that area or on that land for a multitude of generations. So you are saying that Crimea, which was historically Russian, always part of Russia, gifted to the Ukraine as part of a Soviet reshuffle, the people there were Russian, the people there spoke Russian, but their independence vote was absolutely a big Russian gay op. But
it was
this
totally a fake operation.
You see, Greg, what you're doing is you basically look at things from, if you like it, it's real. If you don't, it's not. That is what you're saying.
No, that's not my criterion. But look, the Maidan was not a CIA op. Okay, it was a revolution when a politician who was put in power to pursue EU membership suddenly made an about face because of Russian pressure and Russian bribery. And among the ultra-nationalists who participated in that, there was the Svoboda Party, which ended up in the government, the National Unity Government, after Yanukovych fled the country. And so you're simply wrong. The nationalists were part of the national unity government that took over after Yanukovych.
So I suppose Yanukovych only got elected because the Russians fiddled the polls.
I don't know. Let's just pretend that
So
the
all
polls
the
are
people who
completely
voted
accurate.
for Yanukovych and all the parties that were banned and all the people who were denied a stake in future governments, that's all okay because they don't agree with Greg.
No, that's not my criterion.
That is
Anyway,
absolutely your criteria.
no,
If people
no.
don't agree with Greg, they were paid for by Russian shills, but everything
You
else is
deny
absolutely
that, for
legitimate.
instance, Nick Griffin is getting money from Sputnik right now?
I don't
To
know
be
what
a-
he does. I despise that guy, so I don't know
Yeah.
what he does. I've not had contact with him for years. He's
Yeah.
an absolute traitor to British nationalism, so I wouldn't know. But what I am saying is there are many different leaders in all over the world who have been funded, just as revolutions have, by the CIA and
Oh,
the American state. The
Absolutely.
American
There's no
state
question
have
about it.
meddled more in the affairs of other states than, as I said, any other nation other than Israel.
I wouldn't know about the exact numbers, but there's no question that the United States has got lots of blood on its hands. So we don't
Okay, I
have
just want to
any
let everyone
questions
know
about that.
there is a poll on my Telegram. I pinned it in the live chat where you can vote who won the debate, Mark Collett or Greg Johnson. We've had nearly 400 votes. Mark is winning the vote right now. But if the counter currents, Greg Chills.
Yes, I have
the
paid
results,
shills
I
that
guess.
will come in and we'll hack the election. Actually, we'll
Yeah,
hack the
yeah.
election using
Yeah,
wireless modems to change the results. You
yeah,
saw right through me and the CIA.
Are we wrapping it up
anyway,
now then?
yeah. I think we should probably wrap it up. We just have two last super chats, but I'll just kind of read through them quick. Mark and Dr. Johnson: have more Jews left the Ukraine or Russia since the beginning of the special military operation? It's more of a kind of rhetorical question, I guess. And Miller 210 says, Greg, are you not clinging to a utopian idea of ethno-nationalism? Stronger states expand and trample weaker states. Will this ever really change?
Yeah, I think it can change. But basically what you're saying is that war is inevitable. And what I would like is to find a way of creating a world where there's less war and less conflict. I don't think we can live in a world without it entirely. That's unrealistic, but we can certainly come up with political orders that can minimize unnecessary conflict and suffering. And that's the vision that I have. And that's why I want to comment on this, because I think that if we can get more people thinking in terms of an ethno-nationalist geopolitics, to use a dirty word, rather than the current mess that we've got, we might actually get to a better world.
Do you want to comment on that, Mark, the whole empire versus ethno-nationalism thing?
I think I've made my point clear. The greatest threat to people of European descent is Judeo-American Western liberal democracy. Anything that stands as a powerful counterbalance to that and prevents it from growing aggressively or more aggressively than it already has is a good thing. The fact is, nations that have more openly embraced America and so-called American values are the ones that are fastest headed towards a white minority status. And I think that is the most important thing. But I've had a really good time tonight. Thank you to everyone who's been here, but I think I need to go and get some sleep.
Yeah, I think I'll end the stream there. I think that's a good way to end it. And thank you both for coming on. I think we put on something pretty good. I hope people thought that my moderation was fair. And
Absolutely. I think
yeah,
you were very good. I very much appreciate it, actually, Joel. I think you handled this quite well.
yeah, I just wanted to have a kind of fair hearing for both sides. And I think you both were able to argue everything you wanted to argue. So I think that's a victory for the format. And yeah, thank you both. You both, I think, did a pretty good job. And yeah, thanks a lot for coming on, and thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.